Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. Lightning strikes on Hollow Creek. It started with the rain. At first, it was soft, a whisper against the tin roof of the old cabin I had stumbled upon, seeking refuge from the last stretch of trail before Hollow Creek. The sky had been heavy all day, a grey curtain that refused to lift, and by evening it finally gave way, dumping water in relentless sheets. I had been hiking since dawn, my boots soaked and my clothes sticking uncomfortably to my skin, and I welcomed the storm at first, the way you welcome a shower after a fever. There was a strange comfort in it, a kind of alive energy in the smell of wet pine and the chorus of rain on tin. I thought about the creek down the slope, swollen from the earlier showers, its waters already murmuring and groaning as it spilled over the banks. I didn't yet realize how ominous that sound would become. I had set my pack down and tried to make sense of the cabin. It was small, built from rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age and moisture. Inside, the floorboards creaked under every step, the smell of wet wood and mildew hanging thick. I had no illusions about the place being safe, but it was a shelter, and for the night, that was enough. I leaned against the wall near the door, listening to the wind and rain as they fought each other outside, letting the storm soak into me through the thin fabric of my clothes. In that suspended space, time felt loose, distorted by the rhythm of the storm. I thought about the miles I had traveled and the choices that had led me to this ridge, and I felt both tired and calm, almost lulled by the cadence of rain. Then lightning flashed. It tore across the sky in a sudden, violent line, momentarily casting the world in stark white. The cabin's interior, always shadowed, became a stage for something I couldn't yet name. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of Hollow Creek. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light and shadow. The storm was so bright in that moment, so revealing, that it felt like the world outside had been laid bare just for me. The figure didn't move, didn't do anything but watch, and yet that stillness made it more alive, more unnerving. When the thunder followed immediately, shaking the cabin, I jumped and the image vanished, swallowed by the darkness that the lightning had momentarily banished. I told myself it was nothing. I kept repeating it like a mantra as the rain pounded harder, each flash of lightning bringing the figure back. Every time, it was closer, an inch, maybe two, but enough that my stomach twisted in fear. I tried speaking, calling out into the storm, but my voice disappeared, smothered by the rain and wind, leaving only the pounding of water on tin and the roar of Hollow Creek below. I realized then that the storm was more than just weather. It was a veil, hiding and revealing in turns, playing tricks with perception and fear. The figure remained ambiguous, its features obscured by shadows and rain, but the posture, the way it stood there, unyielding, watching, made me certain that it was deliberate, that it had noticed me just as I had noticed it. Minutes or hours passed. I cannot be sure. My sense of time dissolved into the wet dark and intermittent white flashes of lightning. I tried to occupy myself, pacing the small cabin, checking the windows, trying to find rational explanations. Perhaps it was someone else seeking shelter, perhaps a hiker lost, or a local who had wandered too close. But no rational thought could strip away the raw unease I felt every time the lightning revealed that silhouette, closer, patient, impossibly still. The creek below, swollen with the storm, groaned and gurgled as though carrying the weight of some unseen presence. I could hear it sometimes in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down to the floorboards, sitting on a damp mat I had found. My mind, on some level, refused to sleep, refusing to give the storm the power of rest. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin's walls, and every shiver of movement, every shift in shadow, seemed to be the figure again, measuring me, testing me. I thought about stepping outside to see if it was real, to confront it, but the mud along the edge of the creek would have given me away. Every inch of ground was soft, every footprint permanent. The risk was more than I could bear, yet a part of me wanted to see, to confirm that what I was imagining wasn't some trick of light and fear. The night pressed on, relentless, and I became aware of a rhythm in the storm, a timing that seemed to correspond with the figure's appearances. Lightning, thunder, pause, and then it stood again, in increments closer. I realized that I wasn't simply observing, I was part of something larger, caught in the storm's momentum, a participant in a strange and dangerous ritual. The woods and the creek and the rain had taken on the shape of some unseen story, and I had stumbled into its middle, unprepared. My sense of safety, already fragile, collapsed completely with each return of the figure in the flashes of light. By the time the storm began to weaken, when the heavy rain lessened to a persistent drizzle, the figure was gone. I dared to breathe, thinking that perhaps I had misread the night, misinterpreted shadows and the swollen creek. But when I went outside to the muddy bank, the truth revealed itself with a quiet, unrelenting horror. The mud told a story I could not ignore, a trail of footprints leading from the forest to the creek, stepping deliberately into the water and then nothing beyond. No return, no trail back toward the woods. The figure had come, it had moved closer, and then it had disappeared, leaving only the memory in mud and water, an impression of something real, purposeful, and unknowable. I tried to tell myself that it must have been a local, someone used to the mountains and the storm, who had passed through and found their way into the creek for reasons I could not understand. But that explanation felt hollow, inadequate. The footprints, the timing of the appearances, the way the figure had moved only when lightning revealed it, it all felt deliberate, intelligent, and terrifyingly calm. My heart still pounds at the memory of it, the wet cold of the storm, the smell of damp pine, and the sound of Hollow Creek groaning as though mourning some secret I was not meant to know. I left Hollow Creek at first light, but the trail, the cabin, the storm, and the figure have never left my mind. I have tried to convince myself it was fear, exhaustion, imagination, a natural human reaction to isolation and weather. But I know what I saw, and the mud remains a silent witness to the impossible. Footsteps leading in, but none returning. I sometimes wonder, especially on nights when the storm hits the ridge just right, whether it waits for someone else, whether the creek itself knows the rhythm of fear and curiosity, and whether it will claim another witness. I do not speak of it often, but in my quieter moments, the memory returns, bringing with it the same shiver of dread and the cold, irrevocable sense that something out there watches, patient and eternal, along the edge of the water. I never returned to that cabin. I have never hiked that stretch of the ridge again. Yet, every time I hear rain against my roof, I remember the smell of wet wood, the sound of Hollow Creek, and the way lightning carved that figure into my vision, step by step, until it vanished into mud and memory. And even now, I cannot tell if the figure was real, or if it was a shape conjured by exhaustion and storm. But I know, deep down, that the mud remembers, that the footprints tell a story I was never meant to witness, and that the mountains keep their secrets as they always have, patient and unmoving. I sometimes dream of the creek. of the white flashes, of a figure just at the edge of vision, watching, and I wake with the same feeling of helplessness, of being small and transient against the vastness of the storm and the quiet persistence of something unknown. The storm, the figure, the mud, they are stitched together now, inseparable in my memory, a story that will not let me rest. Story 2, Cabin Door That Wouldn't Stay Closed. The rain had been relentless all afternoon, hammering against my jacket and soaking the trail to the point where every step squelched in the mud. I had been hiking along a ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, hoping to reach the next road before nightfall, but the storm moved faster than I had anticipated, rolling in thick and grey, leaving me with no choice but to seek shelter. I spotted a cabin tucked into the trees, its outline faint through the downpour, and ran toward it praying it was empty. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the interior dim and smelling of wet wood and mold. Relief washed over me as I stepped inside, leaving the rain to pound the tin roof above. I thought I had found safety, at least for the night. Almost immediately the wind found the cabin's weaknesses. The door slammed with a violent thud, rattling the walls and sending a jolt of adrenaline straight through me. I hurried to wedge a broken chair against the latch, hoping it would hold, but each time I turned my back, the door was open again, swinging freely as if the storm itself had a mind. I muttered curses at the wind, tried to calm myself, insisting it was nothing more than a storm with a cabin too old to keep it out. I paced the floor, listening to the relentless downpour, the wooden walls groaning under the strain of wind and rain. It was a familiar rhythm, the sound of old buildings protesting against weather, and for a while I allowed myself to believe that was all it was. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate scraping from above, a slow rhythm against the wooden floorboards of the upper room. My stomach turned over. The cabin had only ever been built for one family, perhaps two at most, and there was no reason for anyone else to be here. My first thought was a hiker like me, desperate and lost in the storm, but a glance out the rain-streaked window revealed nothing, only the forest, soaked and blurred by water. My pulse quickened, my hands sweaty despite the cold, as I realized that whatever was above me wasn't announcing itself. It was listening. I moved toward the stairs, each creak of the old wood making me jump, every shadow seeming to grow larger than it should. The scraping stopped as I approached, replaced by a hollow silence that pressed against my ears. I reached the top and paused, heart hammering, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I saw the door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Though I was certain I had closed it earlier, there was no wind up here, no drafts, only the steady pulse of rain against the roof. My mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the cabin shifted, perhaps the hinges had loosened over decades of neglect. But the unease rooted deep in my chest told me that explanation was thin, fragile. I inched closer to the door, each step deliberate, almost unwilling. The floorboards groaned beneath me, the sound so loud it felt like it might announce me to something unseen. When I reached the threshold, the door creaked wider on its own, as if inviting me in. I held my breath, peering into the dim room, but it was empty, nothing but dust motes dancing in the weak light filtered through broken windows. Relief should have come, but it didn't. Instead, a weight settled on my shoulders, the creeping sensation of eyes tracking me even as the room revealed nothing. I could feel it. The cabin itself was aware, alive in a way that made the air thick and the darkness oppressive. Hours passed in a blur of rain, wind, and uneasy pacing. I tried to occupy myself, checking the windows, trying to prepare a corner with my wet pack, and convincing myself that I was tired, that fear had colored every sound and shadow. But the door refused to stay shut. Every gust of wind, every sudden drop in the storm seemed to force it open again. I could swear I heard faint scuffing above, a soft shuffle that came when I least expected it, ceasing whenever I ran to investigate. I sat on the floor for a while, trying to steady my thoughts, but the isolation and sound of the storm began to wear on me. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a trap, a vessel for an unknown presence that did not need to show itself to unsettle me completely. Night deepened, and sleep was impossible. Every sound became exaggerated, the slap of the tin roof, the groan of floorboards, the whisper of wind through broken shutters. I pressed my back to the wall, listening as shadows stretched unnaturally across the room, anticipating the scraping above or the sudden swing of the door. I imagined figures, someone or something moving just out of sight, measuring me, waiting for me to reveal my own fear. It was exhausting, suffocating, but I dared not leave my spot to check each creaking board. The storm outside had grown to a roar, relentless and indifferent, and inside, the cabin held its own quiet menace. When I finally tried to sleep, curled against the corner near the fireplace, I could not escape the sense of being observed. My dreams were filled with fleeting shadows, doors opening and closing just beyond the edge of perception, the sound of steps that never came close enough to see but close enough to hear. I woke multiple times to find the cabin silent, yet the presence remained, etched into the walls, the air, the very wood under my hands. Every gust of wind against the tin roof made my heart leap, and each time I opened my eyes, I expected to see someone or something standing in the doorway or at the end of the hall. Morning came, though dimly, grey and dripping from the thick clouds that refused to lift. The storm had lessened, but the cabin did not feel safer. I surveyed the space, moving slowly, noting every dent, every scratch in the floorboards, every hinge and latch that refused to cooperate. The scraping had stopped, but the memory lingered. There was no one to be found, no evidence of human presence beyond my own anxious tracks. Yet the feeling that I had not been alone remained, lingering like smoke in the corners, a quiet insistence that the cabin had known me, had measured me, and had decided that my fear was enough. I left shortly after dawn, not daring to linger in the quiet, soaked forest. I did not look back, yet I can still see the door swinging open and closed in my memory, hear the subtle scuffing above, and feel the oppressive, unseen weight of being watched. I have never returned to that trail, nor have I trusted cabins in the backwoods the same way again. The forest holds many things, some rational, some less so, and I now know that even the smallest structure can house a presence, or at least the suggestion of one, capable of shaping fear and memory into something unbearable. Even now, when the wind rises, or when I hear rain against the roof where I live now, I am transported back to that cabin. I can see the dark hallway at the top of the stairs, the door slowly creaking open as if by its own will, and I can hear that faint, maddening scrape across the floorboards above. I remember the hollow ache of fear and uncertainty, and the way the storm seemed to conspire with whatever lingered in the corners. I do not know what I felt that night, whether it was simply my own terror magnified by isolation, or something that genuinely watched, moving unseen, but the memory is seared in my mind, alive, insistent, and not quite explainable. Even in recollection, the cabin seems to breathe, the walls whispering secrets I cannot fully grasp. I remember the cold, the wet wood, the way the storm amplified every shadow, every sound, until I could no longer tell where reality ended and fear began. The sense of eyes on me, the small, inexplicable movements, the way the door refused to stay closed, all of it remains, a quiet, unresolved horror that lingers long after the rain has stopped. A reminder that some places are not merely abandoned, and some nights are not simply weather. The cabin had its secrets, and I left knowing I was not meant to understand them. Story 3: The Vanishing Road in the Fog. The fog rolled in faster than I could have imagined, thick and suffocating, the kind that clings to your skin and seeps into your bones. I had been driving home through the Blue Ridge Mountains, the last rays of sunset fading behind the ridges, leaving the sky a dim, bruised grey. The road was familiar. I'd driven it countless times, but within minutes, everything changed. My headlights barely penetrated the white wall that had settled over the asphalt, the familiar curves and dips of the road vanishing into nothingness. One moment I could see the guardrail, the next it disappeared entirely, replaced by a void of grey that seemed to stretch forever. I slowed, gripping the wheel tighter, trying to focus on what little I could see, but the fog moved like a living thing, swallowing light and sound alike. I tried the radio, hoping for a comforting voice to break the oppressive silence, but static hissed and crackled until even that failed, leaving me with only the sound of the tires on wet asphalt and my own uneven breathing. Every turn seemed to loop me back to the same stretch of road, the bends and curves repeating with unnerving consistency. I started to question my own memory, the landscape bending in ways that didn't make sense, as though the mountains themselves had shifted while I wasn't looking. My chest tightened, the sensation of being watched crawling along my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the damp night air. Then I saw him, or her. I couldn't tell, not clearly. A figure stood in the middle of the road, pale and drenched, completely still, staring directly at me. My heart skipped, the tires threatening to skid on the slick asphalt as I swerved instinctively. When I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished as though it had never been there. Panic rose in my chest, hot and sudden, and I forced myself to keep driving, telling myself I'd imagined it, that the fog was playing tricks, that exhaustion and stress were turning shadows into shapes. But the memory of those pale eyes, the way the figure's gaze had pinned me in place, refused to leave. The fog thickened, turning the world outside the windshield into an endless grey void. I could barely see a few feet ahead, the guardrails disappearing, the trees on either side just shadowy shapes looming in the mist. Each bend seemed to double back on itself, the road unrolling like a twisted ribbon, leading me in circles. I tried to follow the lines painted on the asphalt, but they melted into the fog, leaving me disoriented and tense. Every minute felt like an hour, the car's engine humming a low, constant note that somehow made the isolation worse. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence between the tires' spray against the wet road, loud and accusing. I forced myself to stop thinking about the figure, tried to focus on driving, on keeping control. But every now and then, movement at the edge of my headlights would make me jerk the wheel, brake squealing, only to reveal empty fog and wet asphalt. My nerves frayed, taut as the wire of a fence, and every shadow seemed to hold a presence, watching, waiting. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure there, following, though I knew it made no sense. The mountains were quiet in a way that pressed on me, their silence heavy and ancient, and the fog seemed to amplify it, making every sound, my own breathing, the hum of the engine, unbearably loud. Hours or maybe minutes passed. I cannot be sure. Time lost meaning in the unyielding white. The road kept bending back on itself, curving me toward the same stretch I had passed before. Every landmark seemed familiar, yet subtly wrong, as though memory and reality had begun to fray at the edges. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, the storm earlier, the long hours driving, yet the memory of that figure, standing still in the middle of the road, had carved itself into my mind. It wasn't moving, wasn't running, wasn't calling out, just staring. And I knew, deep in a place I cannot name, that it had noticed me long before I saw it, that it had been waiting. When I finally broke through the thickest part of the fog, I found myself on the same curve I had passed a half hour ago, though it felt like days had passed. The familiar guardrail, the bend in the asphalt, the smell of wet pine, all returned, but the unease remained, settled in my chest like a stone. My hands shook on the wheel, and I dared not glance into the shadows beyond the trees. The radio came back to life, faint voices breaking through the static, but I could not focus on them. My mind kept returning to the figure, its pale face, wet hair plastered to its skull, eyes fixed, and the eerie certainty that it had been aware of me, patient, waiting for the right moment. Even now, thinking back on that night, I cannot reconcile what I saw. There was nothing supernatural, nothing that can be easily dismissed. Only a human form, unnervingly still, and a road that seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. I remember the smell of wet asphalt and pine, the way the fog pressed against the car, the damp cold clinging to my jacket, and the sheer unrelenting disorientation. It was not a place meant to be understood, only endured, and the memory lingers, etched into me with the same sharpness as the headlights cutting through the mist that night. I told no one at first, fearing they would think I had gone mad, that exhaustion and fear had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. And in the weeks after, every time the fog rolled in, every time the night was damp and the road slick, I could feel it again. The weight of that gaze, the suffocating sense of being watched, the impossibility of escape. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, bending the roads, holding the fog, and preserving that memory. I returned to that stretch of road once, during daylight, when the fog had lifted and the mountains seemed ordinary, the curves familiar, the trees nothing more than trees. I could see the road clearly, the guardrails in place, the bends predictable. Yet the sense of unease never left. I remembered the figure, the grey void, and the impossibility of those hours in the fog. I remembered the absolute stillness of that presence, and how the world outside my windshield had become an endless, featureless expanse that threatened to swallow me whole. Even in daylight, the mountains held that memory, a hidden layer of something unreadable, and I felt the same chill of fear creep into my chest. It has haunted me since, not as a single fleeting moment, but as an impression, a warning. I have driven that road less and less, and when I do, I carry with me the memory of the fog, the figure, and the way time itself seemed to loop back on me. I know it was real, or as real as anything can be in that part of the mountains, and I know the mountains remember it too. They remember the way I was caught in the fog, disoriented, terrified, and alone. And even now, when the wind rises and the mist curls through the trees, I feel that same shiver, the memory of eyes that do not blink, and a road that refuses to behave as it should, lingering just beyond my sight, a reminder that some parts of the Blue Ridge are not meant to be understood, only survived. Story 4. Whispering Pines on Thunder Ridge. The storm had been building all afternoon, a low, rolling thunder that pressed against my chest and rattled the windows of the ranger station I had left behind. By the time I reached the trailhead, rain had begun in earnest, hammering against my jacket and soaking the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess. I had intended only a short hike up Thunder Ridge, hoping to reach the old fire lookout before nightfall, but the storm forced me higher, driving me up into the dense stands of pine where the wind cut through the trees like a blade. Every gust made the branches sway violently, groaning under the pressure, and lightning streaked the sky, illuminating the forest in stark white bursts that left my vision raw and trembling. I could see the tallest trees bending as though in pain, their trunks twisting under the force of the wind, and I felt a creeping awareness that the forest itself was alive, observing my passage. I was concentrating on keeping my footing when I first noticed the voices. They were subtle at first, lost under the howl of the wind and the crack of distant thunder. But then they became distinct, fragmented, impossibly close. Whispers threading through the spaces between the trunks, coming from directions I could not pin down. I froze, straining my ears, heart hammering. The voices were incoherent, nothing I could understand, but they were deliberate, insistent, weaving through the storm in a way that no natural sound could. I tried calling out, telling myself it was the wind playing tricks, that my imagination had been worn thin from hours of hiking in rain and cold. But the whispers persisted, shifting just beyond reach whenever I moved toward them, teasing me through the soaked undergrowth and the swaying pines. I followed them cautiously, my boots sinking into mud and wet needles, branches whipping my face with each step. The forest felt endless in the storm, each flash of lightning revealing only more trunks, more shadows, and then darkness again as the thunder drowned the light. Every step I took seemed to pull the whispers further away, leading me deeper into the high ridge where the trail disappeared beneath a tangle of roots and fallen branches. The rain was relentless, running in rivulets down my face, soaking through my clothes, and yet I felt compelled to keep moving toward the voices, a mix of curiosity and unease driving me forward. The forest had grown strange, disorienting, the familiar path I had intended to follow lost beneath the storm's intensity. The whispers shifted again, closer now, brushing against the edges of my perception. I could feel the pressure of them against my ears, the cadence almost rhythmic, like someone or something breathing through the storm. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps to the safety of the trailhead, but my body felt slow, clumsy, as if the forest itself resisted my retreat. Each flash of lightning revealed only more shadows, more trees leaning in impossible angles, and I realized with a cold certainty that I was no longer on the trail I had entered. The path had vanished, and I had become part of the storm, caught in a section of ridge that seemed to exist outside the usual map of the mountains. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps seconds, and the wind pressed against me with a relentless force, carrying the fragmented whispers further into my mind. I could not tell where they came from, whether the storm had hidden some secret in the trees, or whether my own senses had betrayed me entirely. Every turn, every step, brought the whispers closer to an edge I could never reach. The forest was alive in a way I had never felt, and the pines seemed to bend around me, enclosing, shifting imperceptibly, hiding whatever had called me in the first place. My hands were raw from gripping branches and roots for balance, my legs shaking from exertion and fear, and yet I could not stop. Finally, the storm began to relent, the rain tapering into a steady drizzle, the wind losing its teeth. Lightning flashes became sparse, thunder rolling in distant murmurs, and with the fading storm, the forest fell into a tense, almost unnatural silence. The whispers ceased, leaving only the soft hiss of rain dripping from needles and the occasional crack of a branch settling back into place. I stood frozen for a long moment, listening, straining to hear any trace of them, but there was nothing. I realized then that I was completely alone, or at least entirely unobserved, but the memory of the whispers pressed against me like a weight I could not shake. I turned to find the trail, but the ridge had changed. Every landmark I thought I recognized was displaced, subtle but unsettlingly wrong. The old fire lookout, a small clearing, a bend in the ridge. I could find none of it. It was as though the storm had rearranged the forest while I was distracted, or perhaps I had wandered into a section of thunder ridge that existed outside memory, hidden in the folds of pine and shadow. The air hung heavy with damp and decay, and I realized with a rising panic that I had no idea how to return. only the faint impression that I had been led here deliberately. I moved cautiously, following faint depressions in the mud, broken branches, the occasional moss-covered root, anything that might hint at a path. The pines towered above me, still swaying gently in the post-storm wind, and I felt the weight of their presence, their branches whispering secrets I could not understand. Each step made me hyper-aware of the forest around me, every shadow a potential watcher, every rustle in the brush a possible continuation of the whispers I could no longer hear. The storm had ended, but the ridge was still alive, still conspiring in silence, holding me in a liminal space between relief and dread. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes, before I stumbled onto a trail I recognized, the faint outline of a familiar ridge showing through the mist. I paused, breathing hard, drenched and shivering, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination, fatigue, and fear amplified by isolation and weather. But I knew the truth. The whispers had been real, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and they had guided me into a part of the ridge I had never intended to see. I could not shake the sensation that the forest itself had marked me, that the trees had observed my passage and allowed me to leave, but only barely. By the time I returned to the trailhead and eventually the road, night had fallen fully, the mountains fading into shadowed silhouettes under the waning storm clouds. I tried to recount what had happened, the voices, the shifting ridge, the sensation of being drawn deeper into the pines. But even as I spoke, the details eluded me, slipping like wet pine needles through my fingers. I knew some part of the forest remained with me, a residue of the ridge and the storm, a memory that could not be rationalized. I left Thunder Ridge that night, shaken and cautious, aware that the mountains had layers I could not see, paths I could not retrace, and presences that might never be known. Even now, when the wind rises or rain begins to fall on my roof, I feel that same weight pressing against me, subtle but insistent, whispering in a language I do not understand. I do not know if the forest had intentionally led me into that hidden section of Thunder Ridge, or if my own fear and exhaustion had conjured the voices, but the ridge has never left my memory. The pines remain, swaying in storms, patient, silent, hiding secrets that are impossible to speak of without feeling the same creeping dread I felt that night. I do not return to that ridge, and I do not speak often of it, yet the whispers linger, just at the edge of perception, reminding me that the forest remembers, that some corners of the world hold themselves apart from human understanding, and that the mountains will always guard their mysteries in silence. Story 5. Distant screams through the downpour. The first clap of thunder had me sprinting through the underbrush before I even realized what I was doing. I'd set up camp on a narrow ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains that morning, convinced I could handle a night alone in the wilderness, and for the first few hours, it had been almost peaceful. The wind rustled the pines above me, the smell of wet earth filling the air, and I felt almost like I belonged there, even if only for a night. But the storm moved fast, rolling in from the east with a low, grumbling growl that rattled in my chest. Rain hit the canvas of my tent with a furious intensity, and I thought at first that the storm itself was enough to keep me on edge. I could hear the thunder bouncing between the ridges, see the jagged lines of lightning split the sky. But it was the scream that came afterward that changed everything. It was distant at first, carried by the rain, muffled and wavering, but unmistakably human. A raw, desperate scream that sliced through the howling wind. I froze, gripping the flap of my tent, heart hammering in my chest. My rational mind screamed that it was probably another camper, someone caught in the storm, maybe a hiker who'd lost their way, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something strange about it. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, almost aware of me. I hesitated, debating whether to stay put, but something deeper compelled me forward. I grabbed my flashlight and sloshed through the mud, heading toward the ridge where the sound seemed to carry, trying to keep the high ground between me and the roaring creek below. Every time I thought I was getting closer, the scream would shift, always just ahead, always slipping beyond reach. It wasn't echoing naturally. It moved in a way that felt wrong, like it was tethered to me, always one step further. I called out, half hoping someone would answer, half hoping they wouldn't, but only the rain answered back, relentless and blinding. The flashlight beam shook in my hand, catching glimpses of wet, twisted tree trunks, slick moss, and fallen limbs, but nothing that explained the noise. I tried to remember the trail I had taken, the markers I'd noted, but the storm seemed to warp the forest itself. Every ridge looked the same, every dip in the trail indistinguishable from the last. Panic began to creep in, slow and insidious. My lungs burned as I ran, my legs slick with mud, and the scream came again, closer yet farther than I could reconcile. I stumbled, falling into a shallow hollow, water soaking through my clothes, and for a moment I thought I'd lost it entirely. But then I caught the faint outline of a figure, or maybe it was just a trick of the lightning in the distance. I pointed the flashlight toward it, and the rain distorted the beam into a blur. Whatever it had been, it was gone before I could focus on it, leaving only the echo of my own ragged breathing and the distant, inhuman wail. Night came quickly in the storm. The sky was a dense wall of black clouds, pierced only by the occasional flash of lightning that left the forest stark and frozen in brief, blinding white. The trail beneath my feet vanished in the downpour, and I realized I had no idea where I was. I tried to retrace my steps, tried to head back to the small clearing where I'd left my pack, but the world had become unrecognizable. Every tree looked the same, every ridge and hollow mirrored the last. The scream returned, softer now, as if it were testing me, circling me, always just out of reach. I tried shouting, tried calling for help, but the rain swallowed my voice. It was then I noticed the silence around it. The forest, otherwise alive with storm, was oddly muted. The animals had gone quiet, the wind seemed to bend around me, and the scream carried with an unnatural clarity that made my skin crawl. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning. I kept moving, chasing the sound, slipping and sliding on the wet earth, drenched to the bone. My flashlight caught the gleam of something half buried in the mud. A boot, old, worn, its leather cracked. I paused, stomach twisting. There was no hiker I knew of missing around here, at least not recently, and the boot seemed impossibly small, almost like it belonged to a child. The scream returned, closer this time, more desperate, almost pleading. I shined the light into the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless dripping darkness of the forest. Eventually, I stopped running, my chest heaving, my legs shaking. I leaned against a tree and tried to make sense of it. The scream wasn't random. I could feel it in my bones, the way it pulled me through the forest, always leading, always just out of reach. It was as if the mountain itself wanted me to follow, wanted me to go deeper, and I felt the edge of a terrifying thought creep into my mind. Maybe I wasn't meant to leave this ridge. Maybe the scream had been waiting for me, calling me here all along. I shook my head, trying to fight the panic, telling myself I was just exhausted, that the storm had disoriented me, that no human could possibly survive out here in this downpour for long without leaving signs. And yet, the scream came again, soft, haunting, closer now, as if someone or something stood just beyond my flashlight's beam. I walked slowly, almost cautiously through the wet, fallen leaves, trying to keep my footing, following the faint sound of the scream. It moved again, over a small rise, and I climbed after it, boots sinking into the mud. I came to a small clearing, the center lit for an instant by lightning, and I could see the ridge I had started on so close, and yet impossibly far. The scream came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the ridges, bending and warping around me. I spun in circles, disoriented, and then silence. Nothing but the soft pounding of rain on the trees. I shivered, realizing I had no idea which way to go, that the forest had closed around me in a way it hadn't before. I sank to the ground, leaning against a tree, and tried to collect my thoughts. The scream had faded into the storm, but its echo lingered, a memory etched into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that the forest itself had eyes, that the mountain had taken notice of me. I stayed there until the rain slowed, until the first hints of dawn pierced the storm clouds, and I began to crawl back toward what I hoped was my campsite. Every step was uncertain, every ridge looked familiar and wrong, all at once. The forest seemed endless, stretching on without clear direction, and the scream, though silent now, had marked me in some way I couldn't understand. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing where I had set up camp, the tent was soaked through, the gear half buried in mud, but otherwise untouched. No footprints except my own marred the earth. I didn't dare stay. I packed quickly, every shadow making me flinch, every rustle of leaves sounding like another desperate wail. I started down the ridge, careful to follow the faint tracks I could still make out, and after what felt like hours, I finally found the main trail that led down the mountain. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of that night. I tell myself it was just the storm, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark, wet wilderness. But I know better. I know the scream was real, and whatever or whoever it belonged to, it was still out there, somewhere on that ridge, waiting. I can close my eyes and hear it, faint, distant, carrying across the ridges, a sound I could run toward but never reach. The Blue Ridge doesn't give up its secrets easily, and I learned, far too late, that some calls are not meant to be answered. Even now, I sometimes wake in the dark, imagining that rain-soaked scream echoing just outside my window, and I can't help but wonder how many others have heard it and followed, never to return. The memory lingers, more vivid than any dream, a chilling reminder that the mountains are alive in ways you can't always see or escape. I left the ridge that morning, soaked, shivering, and certain I had seen and heard something I could never explain. Friends and family asked if I had gotten lost, laughed it off, said it was just a storm and my nerves. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to convince myself that the scream was nothing, that the forest was empty and silent except for wind and rain. But deep down, I knew better. The scream was out there still, moving through the trees, carried by the wind and the storm, an echo in the Blue Ridge that would not leave me alone. And sometimes, when the clouds roll in and the night gets thick with mist and rain, I can almost hear it again, calling my name, daring me to come back. I never have. I never will. Story 6. Flooded Bridge. Shadows. The rain came down in sheets that afternoon, so sudden and heavy that it seemed to blot out the entire world. I had been hiking along the old logging paths near Mill Creek, the trail I knew so well, now unrecognizable beneath the slick, swollen mud. The creek had risen rapidly, turning from a lazy trickle into a roaring, angry torrent, and I could hear the water battering against the banks before I even saw it. That's when I realized I'd have to cross the old bridge, a structure I'd always thought of as charming, quaint even, with its rotting wooden planks and rusted beams. But now, submerged halfway by the flood, it looked more like a relic teetering on the edge of disaster. My boots squelched in the mud as I approached, the wind whipping rain into my eyes, and I paused at the edge, staring down at the water that roared and churned beneath the bridge. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Something in me compelled me forward, and I stepped onto the first plank. The wood groaned under my weight, soaking up the water that had already pooled across the surface. I kept my eyes fixed on the far side, trying not to look into the swirling shadows beneath. The current moved faster than I expected, black and violent, carrying debris and splintered branches with it, and then I saw it. Or at least, I think I did. Something dark, a shape that didn't belong to the water, darting just below the surface. I froze mid-step, my heart hammering. The shape moved unnaturally fast, almost swimming against the current with a precision that made no sense. For a second, I swore I saw a face, pale and indistinct, eyes glaring up at me from the depths before it vanished into the churning water. I blinked, shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the shadows, but the unease clung to me like wet clothes. I continued cautiously, each step a creak and a shudder through the wooden boards, the storm amplifying every sound until it seemed to echo across the valley. The wind carried a low, mournful moan from somewhere downstream, and for a brief moment I imagined it was a voice, soft, trembling, calling my name, but I convinced myself it was only the water against the supports. Then I felt it, a pressure, as if the current beneath the bridge was alive in some way, watching me, aware of each movement. My gut tightened. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the far bank was still distant, and I was already halfway across. A sudden splash jolted me, water leaping over the edge of the bridge as if something had surged from below. I yelped and stumbled, catching myself against the wet railing. There, for a heartbeat, a dark figure, humanoid in shape but impossibly fluid, rose from the frothing water, then disappeared just as quickly. I swear I saw it reach toward me, even as I spun my head side to side, convinced the next moment would reveal it again. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind raced with the kind of panic that feels almost primal, older than reason. I imagined someone, or something, lurking under the bridge for years, waiting for anyone foolish enough to cross during the floods, and the thought froze me in place. I forced my legs to move again, each step a battle against the shaking in my knees and the slick planks beneath my feet. The wind screamed in my ears now, and lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the creek in stark, white bursts. In those brief flashes, I thought I caught glimpses of more shapes, darker and quicker than any fish could be, sliding and twisting just under the surface, watching, waiting. I could feel eyes on me, though no one was there. The bridge didn't feel like a bridge anymore. It felt like a threshold into something I wasn't meant to understand, and the water beneath seemed almost aware, ready to pull me down if I faltered. I reached the midpoint and stopped again, gripping the railing, breathing so hard that it rattled in my chest. My boots were soaked, and the cold of the water creeping up through the planks seemed to bite into my bones. And then I heard it, a low, gurgling sound, almost like a laugh, but wet and hollow, coming from directly below. I jumped, stumbling backward, the boards shivering beneath me. I peered down into the flood, and for a brief, frozen moment, I thought I saw multiple eyes staring up from the black water, blinking in the lightning. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was just debris, just shadows, anything but what my mind wanted to suggest. Still, a knot of fear wrapped around my stomach, tightening with every second I stayed there. Finally, I forced my legs to carry me forward, faster now, almost running across the bridge. Each plank moaned, threatening to give way, and the railing was slick with rain and slime. I felt the current tug at the supports, at the edges of the wood, like the river itself resented my passage. Another splash, sudden and sharp, jolted me, and I swear I felt a brush against my ankle, cold and slick, as if something had tried to grab me. I screamed, half from panic, half from disbelief, and pushed onward with all the strength my legs could muster. The far bank grew closer, and with it, the promise of solid ground, though I didn't dare relax, even as my boots hit mud once more. When I turned to look back at the bridge from the bank, the water had already returned to its usual shape. Or maybe it had never been different. The boards were slick and half submerged, but the shadows, the shapes I thought I saw, were gone. I scanned the creek, the storm still pounding down, the water roiling and brown, but there was nothing to see except the aftermath of the flood. Yet I knew, deep down, that whatever had brushed my leg, whatever had moved beneath me, hadn't left. The feeling lingered like a weight in my chest, the certainty that the creek held more than water and mud, that some part of it, something patient, dark, and waiting, remained even after the storm passed. I trudged back along the logging path, boots heavy with mud, clothes drenched, teeth chattering from the cold. The rain began to lighten, a dull drizzle now, but the creek still roared like it had a life of its own. Every sound, the snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of eyes following me from the shadows along the bank. When I finally returned to my car, parked on a higher trail where the rain hadn't reached as fiercely, I couldn't bring myself to look back at the bridge again. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of it, the silent promise of whatever lingered in its depths. I left the mountains that day without a word to anyone, my voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. And though the sun returned the next morning, the creek looked harmless, peaceful almost, with the boards of the old bridge just as rotten and still as they had always been. But I know the truth. The water remembers, the shadows wait, and the bridge is no mere crossing. It is a threshold, a trap, and I, foolish enough to test it, had glimpsed only the surface of what it holds. Even now, weeks later, I can't hear the distant roar of a river without thinking of the shapes beneath the flood, moving with a speed and intelligence no human mind should recognize. Sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, I swear I feel the brush of cold water against my ankle, and I know, without a doubt, that whatever was there that day is still out there, waiting for the next storm. The mountains never forget, and neither does the bridge. It stands over Mill Creek, silent to all who cross it in calm weather, but alive during the storms. And the water below, it does not forgive, it does not forget, and it never releases what it has claimed. I learned that the hard way, and I carry the memory like a scar, the certainty that some thresholds are never meant to be crossed, no matter how familiar the path may seem. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles the windows, I swear I hear the low gurgle of that water, a reminder that some things in the Blue Ridge are watching, patient and hungry, and that crossing into their domain leaves a mark that never fades. I never return to the creek. I don't know if anyone else has crossed that bridge during a flood, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that day changed something in me, something I can't name, something that left me aware of the dark patience that resides in places we think we know. The storm, the water, the rotting boards. All of it seemed to conspire to show me a glimpse of something utterly indifferent and yet aware. And now, whenever it rains hard, I can't help but picture those dark shapes darting beneath the surface, waiting for someone else foolish enough to cross the bridge, to challenge the creek, to test its memory. And I hope, for anyone who follows the path I once took, that they never see what I saw or feel what I felt, because some encounters leave a weight that never lifts, and some bridges hold secrets better left undiscovered. The creek has returned to its usual murmur now, a river like any other in the Blue Ridge, but I know it carries more than water. The shapes beneath the surface, whatever they were, are patient, and they remember. And in the quiet moments, When the wind is low and the mountains settle into dusk, I can almost hear them whispering through the currents, calling to anyone who dares to tread the old bridge during the storm. I will never return, but the memory clings to me, a persistent chill that not even the warmth of summer can erase. That bridge, the water beneath it, and the storm that revealed its true nature, they are a warning. And I carry it with me every time I pass a creek, every time I hear a river in flood, knowing some places are better left untouched, and some crossings should never be attempted, no matter how familiar the path may seem. Story 7. Abandoned Shack at Hollow Hill. The rain hit first as a fine mist, then quickly escalated into a relentless torrent that hammered against my jacket and backpack, soaking me to the skin before I even realized how far I'd strayed from the trail. I had been hiking all afternoon, the familiar rhythm of the Blue Ridge trails comforting at first, until the clouds thickened and the wind began to moan through the trees like some ancient lament. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the narrow path beneath my boots dissolved into mud, slick and treacherous. I kept moving, hoping to reach a familiar marker, a bend in the ridge, or some hint of a campsite, but the storm seemed to stretch the landscape into unfamiliar proportions. That's when I saw it, a jagged silhouette on the crest of the ridge, the outline of a shack, half collapsed and leaning as if it had been abandoned for decades. Relief surged through me, sharp and urgent, though I didn't yet know whether it was shelter or some other peril waiting. I reached the shack with a clumsy stumble, my boots slipping in the mud, and the smell hit me before I even crossed the threshold. Damp wood, mold, and something fouler, something sour and metallic that pricked at the back of my throat made me gag. I coughed, pressing a sleeve to my mouth, and stepped inside, careful not to disturb the unstable floorboards. The interior was dim, lit only by the muted grey of the storm filtering through holes in the roof. Every shadow seemed to pulse, shifting with the sway of the walls in the wind. The floor sagged in places, water dripping from the ceiling into shallow pools that reflected the scant light in fractured, eerie patterns. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that it was just an abandoned shack, nothing more. But the air felt alive, thick with anticipation, like the pause before some unseen predator struck. The walls were scratched with crude symbols, lines and shapes etched deep into the wood. I knelt, squinting at them, trying to make sense of their meaning. At first, they seemed random, the work of someone insane or bored, but the more I stared, the more I felt them press against my mind. They were warnings, or prayers, or perhaps confessions. Whatever they were not meant for me, and yet their message clung to me, cold and insistent. I stepped back and ran my hands along the wall, tracing the grooves, feeling the splintered wood bite my skin, tiny shards embedding themselves in my palms. I wanted to laugh at my own fear, to mock the shadows and the symbols, but the sound stuck in my throat, swallowed by the wind and the pounding rain. I found a corner where the walls seemed more intact, and I sat, huddling beneath the dripping roof, trying to keep my teeth from chattering. Every gust of wind rattled the shack like bones in a coffin, and every drop of rain struck like a hammer. I tried to focus on practicalities, how long the storm might last, how much food and water I had left, the distance back to the main trail. But my thoughts kept being dragged away by something else, something subtle, insistent, the presence. At first it was a sense, a prickle along the back of my neck, a feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation, the storm, and the fear of being stranded were twisting reality. But then I heard it, a soft shift behind me, a scrape of wood that couldn't have been caused by the wind. My heart thumped violently, and I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound stopped, leaving the oppressive silence in its wake. I dared a glance over my shoulder and the corner was empty. Nothing but shadows. I told myself I was imagining it, yet every few minutes the sensation returned, more insistent. A movement just at the edge of vision, a pressure in the air like someone circling me, studying me from the darkness. I tried calling out, my voice rough and hoarse, but it disappeared into the storm. There was no echo, no acknowledgement, just the cold indifference of the shack and the whispers in the rain. Whispers, almost inaudible at first, like the wind carrying fragments of conversation from elsewhere. But there was a cadence, a pattern, a human quality that made my skin crawl. I could not understand the words, though I strained my ears until my jaw ached, but I knew instinctively that they were meant to warn or guide, or perhaps mock me. Every time I moved, the whispers shifted, always just out of reach, impossibly close, yet never arriving in full. Hours passed in this tense limbo. I couldn't sleep, my body exhausted, but my mind too alert, scanning every shadow, listening for every sound. I counted the minutes by the crash of the rain, by the wind tearing at the walls, by the occasional scuttle behind me that seemed to move in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I tried to convince myself that it was the structure settling, rats, or the storm, but deep down I knew it was something else, something patient, waiting, and yet I could not see it. The shack had become a cage of my own making, trapping me in a silence that was louder than any scream. I moved carefully from corner to corner, checking the walls, the floor, the ceiling, but every glance revealed only emptiness, yet the feeling of being watched never wavered. At some point, I realized that my flashlight had slipped from my jacket and lay across the floor, casting a thin, quivering cone of light. I picked it up, shaking, and swept it across the walls. The symbols seemed to shift with the angle of the beam, taking on forms I did not recognize. Some looked like faces, twisted and pleading, others like clawed hands reaching out, or so my imagination told me. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself that my mind was unraveling, that the storm, the isolation, the mud and rain and exhaustion were conspiring to break me. But the feeling did not leave. The presence was patient, quiet, and calculating. It did not rush. It did not strike. It simply observed, an invisible predator waiting for me to make the wrong move. I thought about leaving, slipping back into the forest despite the storm, risking the slick trail and the possibility of injury. But the storm outside was unrelenting, and the thought of being caught in the open, alone, in that rain and wind, seemed worse than whatever haunted this crumbling shack. I settled in one corner, pressing myself against the wall, and tried to make myself small, almost invisible. I counted the minutes by the rhythm of the rain, by the subtle movements around me, by the whispers that seemed to grow slightly louder with each hour. I told myself that the dawn would come, that the storm would pass, and that whatever this was would fade with the night. But I knew, deep down, that some things did not fade. Some things waited. By morning, the storm had lessened, leaving only a fine drizzle and the lingering, suffocating humidity of the forest. I waited, listening, expecting the shack to be empty, expecting the morning light to reveal nothing more than damp walls and mud. But the presence remained. I could feel it in the shadows, in the angles of the walls, in the silence between the drips of water. I gathered my pack slowly, every movement measured, every sound amplified in the stillness. I stepped outside, and the forest greeted me with the pale grey light of early morning, the mud slick beneath my boots, the trees bending with the last gusts of wind. I looked back at the shack, half collapsed and still, and I wondered what had called me here, what had waited for me in the dark, and why it had not revealed itself. I did not stop to examine it further, not then and not later. I took the trail back down the ridge, my pace quickened by fear and adrenaline, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate pursuit. But the forest was silent, almost too silent, and the memory of the whispers clung to me like wet clothes to my skin. Days later, I would still hear them when I closed my eyes, faint and elusive, riding the edges of memory like shadows just beyond reach. I never returned to that ridge. I never spoke of the shack, not to friends, not to anyone who might dismiss it. Yet the memory follows me, a heavy presence, a weight of unanswered questions and unresolved fear. And I know deep down that whatever I encountered that night is still there, waiting for the next person who thinks they can find shelter in the hills of the Blue Ridge, in a crumbling shack atop a ridge where the rain never truly washes away the past. The memory lingers, unshakable, and I realize now that some places are not meant to be understood, some nights not meant to be survived without leaving a part of yourself behind. Even in the clear light of day, the shapes of the hills, the twisted outlines of trees, the whisper of wind through the branches, carry that night with them. I can feel it when I close my eyes, when I try to sleep, when I walk through the forest or simply sit alone in silence. The shack, the symbols, the shifting presence, they have become a part of me, a caution I cannot unlearn. And the rain will fall again, and the forest will remember, and those who wander too far might hear the whispers as I did, calling from corners of the mind that can never fully comprehend, from places no one truly survives. I think often about that night, and I realize that fear is not in what we see, but in what lingers unseen, in what follows without sound, in what waits in corners that the light cannot reach. The memory is a weight, a shadow that bends with the contours of my thoughts. I sometimes wonder if I was ever alone, or if the presence was simply patient, observing a mistake, a trespasser, a moment of weakness in a place where the hills themselves hold their own secrets and the wind carries them like a slow, deliberate warning to anyone who might chance the same path. I do not know what I would do if I returned. I do not know if I want to know. But the whispering follows, and it will not be ignored. And now, when the rain begins, I do not watch the clouds with curiosity or anticipation. I watch them with caution, remembering the night at Hollow Hill, remembering the shack and the presence that moved behind me, remembered only in the touch of the wind, in the fleeting glance at empty corners, in the certainty that some things remain, waiting. The forest holds them, and they hold me in turn, forever part of a story I cannot tell fully, a memory that cannot fade, a fear that cannot be soothed. By the time the sun rises, the forest is calm, deceptively normal. The rain has softened, the mud begins to dry, the trees stand tall in quiet majesty. But I know the truth. The shack atop Hollow Hill is still there, the whispers still lingering, and whatever waits in its corners still watches, patient and unseen. And I know that some part of me never left that night, never truly stepped back into the safe light of the day. I carry it with me, a shadow, a memory, a warning, and when the wind whistles through the hills, I hear it again, soft, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Story 8. Lightning reveals hidden faces. The storm came out of nowhere, like the mountains themselves had ripped the sky open. I had been hiking a familiar trail along the ridge, the one that cut through the densest part of the forest, thinking I could outrun the weather if it ever turned. But that morning, the clouds rolled in faster than I could comprehend, black and swollen, and within minutes the rain fell in sheets, soaking me to the bone. The first lightning strikes were distant, cracking across the sky with an almost casual fury. I thought I was alone, just the wind in the trees and the hiss of water streaming down the slick trail. Then it started, The brief, sharp glimpses between the flashes. Faces. At first I shook my head, blaming shadows on wet bark or the twisting of leaves in the wind. But with each strike, the faces became clearer, frozen in expressions I couldn't quite name. They were human, yes, but wrong, twisted, staring in ways that made my skin crawl. Some grinned, some wept, some seemed to leer with a dark understanding, as if the forest itself knew things I did not. I froze when the next bolt hit close enough to turn night into day for a heartbeat. One face stood out among the chaos, framed perfectly by the jagged lightning, mere feet from where I had stopped. Its grin was wide, teeth glinting in the brief illumination, and its eyes burned with a wet intelligence. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if I could help, but the sound caught in my throat. There was something in the way it held its gaze, something demanding I understand its presence without ever speaking. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the trees around me seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into impossible angles. The trail that had been so clear a minute ago twisted unnaturally, leading me in circles as though the forest were breathing, alive with intent. I ran, splashing through the mud, branches whipping against my soaked jacket. Every lightning strike revealed more faces, hidden in the folds of the forest, some human, some grotesque distortions that lingered in the corners of my vision. They weren't monsters in the supernatural sense, at least not as I know them, but they radiated an uncomfortable familiarity, as if they had once been people I should have recognized but couldn't. One flash revealed a woman with long, stringy hair, eyes hollow and wet, staring at me with a mournful hunger. Another bolt showed a man whose mouth had been stretched in a silent scream, teeth bared and skin pale against the dark trunk of an oak. I forced myself to keep moving, but the forest had become an intricate maze. The trail folded back on itself, roots and mud conspiring to slow me down. My boots slipped, my hands clawed at branches for balance, and with every flash, I caught glimpses of those eyes, those twisted faces following me, circling me. Rain poured into my eyes, blurring the line between sky and tree, and yet I could not escape the sense of being watched. The air felt charged, thick with static and anticipation, and my chest ached as I pushed forward blindly. At some point, I thought I heard laughter, low and wet, echoing off the trees, as if carried from a great distance, and then folded back around me. I spun in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing but dark trunks and sheets of rain. The lightning strikes were coming faster now, illuminating the forest in rapid, violent bursts, and each time the faces seemed closer, more detailed. I began to recognize features that should not have existed, eyes that reflected the storm itself, mouths twisted into impossible angles, skin mottled with water and grime, expressions that conveyed knowledge of unspeakable things. It was no longer just fear. It was a deep, gnawing unease that burrowed into my mind, as if the forest intended to claim my sanity along with my body. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was fatigue, dehydration, the storm playing tricks on a frayed mind. But even as I repeated the mantra, "It's just your imagination, it's just your imagination," the flashes of lightning brought undeniable clarity. They were real. The faces were real. One, in particular, the grin I had first seen had returned. It hovered at the edge of a fallen log, expression frozen, and when our eyes met, my stomach lurched with recognition, not of the person, but of what it represented. A warning, perhaps, or a gatekeeper, or maybe just a fragment of the forest's memory. I could not tell. I did not want to. The rain seemed to fall harder, each drop striking like a pin, and I realized my shoes were slipping, my body soaked and trembling, yet I could not stop. Every flash of lightning tore open the black veil around me, forcing the knowledge that I was utterly alone in something that was watching me with patient malice. Eventually, I stumbled onto a patch of clearer ground, where the trees thinned and the trail, barely visible, seemed more solid. Relief surged in me, shallow and temporary, because even here, the lightning showed new horrors. I remember one bolt illuminating a hollow, and within it, a face pressed against the darkness, eyes wide, watching me. It was not moving, but its awareness of me was palpable. I fell to my knees, splashing in the mud, shaking, and the image stayed burned in my mind long after the light receded. The storm was relentless, but exhaustion and panic forced my legs to carry me anyway, my lungs heaving, my thoughts fragmented. Every snap of a branch, every rush of wind, every hollow sound of water running through the forest became proof that the forest was not just alive, it was conscious. It had a memory, a will, and it was aware of me in a way I could not escape. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning beneath the storm. The sky eventually lightened, rain softening into drizzle, but the after-image of those faces remained. I could not forget them, even when I reached the safety of the trailhead, where a few hardy hikers moved obliviously through puddles, umbrellas held high. I wanted to tell someone, to scream, to warn them, but the words would not come out. There was no bridge between my experience and the normal world. The storm had shown me a reality layered beneath the familiar forest, a hidden truth that could not be conveyed without risk of disbelief or worse, mockery. And so I kept silent, the images burning behind my eyes, their silent laughter echoing long after the storm had passed. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, shadows in the rain, fatigue playing cruel tricks. But the pattern of recognition, the familiarity in those faces, the sinister awareness, haunted me. Dreams became echo chambers of the storm, lightning revealing not just the forest, but the weight of observation, as if the land itself recorded intrusions and trespasses. Sometimes, at night, I can hear it again, the rustle of leaves, a snap of twig, a faint movement at the edge of vision, and for a moment, I swear I see a familiar grin flicker between the trees. I know I cannot return, cannot retrace my steps, yet the memory clings with the weight of inevitability. The forest watches, remembers, waits, and I am only one among countless trespassers who have glimpsed what should not be seen. The lesson is simple and horrifying in its clarity. In the mountains, the familiar can shift into something profoundly alien with nothing more than a storm and the right flash of light. You may tell yourself it is imagination, coincidence, or the play of shadows, but when the lightning illuminates the faces, human, grotesque, and impossibly aware, you will understand that the world beneath the canopy has its own memory, its own gaze, and its own justice. I never return to that trail. I avoid storms. And still, years later, whenever the sky cracks with lightning, I catch a glimpse of a grin at the edge of my mind, a silent echo of that night, and I know the forest has not forgotten me.